Good evening, number 2 in the videos that are reposting my blog posts. It's day 11 here at CoderAcademy, or was day 11. I'm wearing my CoderAcademy shirt. Definitely has nothing to do with the fact that I haven't done any laundry in the last week and I'm running out of shirts. This is definitely something I chose to wear. And so today at the CoderAcademy we were introduced to a couple of concepts. One was test-driven development. The other one was what it is to handle an error. So we're looking at things at like begin and rescue and end, and then raising, and then also defining our own errors. And I think even having made sure I actually looked at a little bit of this beforehand, I found myself like looking at it being like, oh man, like this is such a bit of a weird thing to wrap my head around. I felt like I did all right with it, but it certainly seemed like some other humans in the course were struggling with it a little bit. So I thought I would do a bit of a, I don't know, just run through it in my head. A, to help solidify for myself, and B, maybe the way I explain it works for some other people. Whereas the way it was explained today maybe didn't click for some people. I don't know. Maybe hearing it again helps, but certainly helps for me. So here we go. Up here at the top, basically I've just done up a little file already of just sort of like what I think is a decent-ish flow to go through and think about the stuff. So the first kind of thing is like, I think this is where I saw some people getting tripped up a little bit, is what is an actual rescue block? Like, what is it doing? A rescue block is, or at least in my head, I don't know if this is what we actually call it, but the rescue block is just like your like if-else block. These things can't exist. You can't just say like begin and not end it. You can't just, well, you probably can, but it feels weird to me to just say rescue but not begin, and I'm pretty sure you can't do it without an end. So like just thinking about the syntax that way, being like, okay, if I want to rescue something, this is what it's going to look like, just as if I'm using if else to do a control flow or a case. Like there is a certain syntax that I need to follow, and this is the syntax. You begin, and then beneath your begin is what is going to be the code that might break things. Like that's what you're doing. You're going begin, and then you're trying to run some code. And then the rescue part, code that will execute or run if things break. I think that's like a good way to understand it. Like if you begin and the code that might break things runs and it doesn't break things, then this whole part just gets ignored. Like this is no longer relevant. It doesn't, like it's disregarded. But if it breaks, it's going to be like, oh, okay, if something's broken, I'm going to look for a rescue. Here it is. Great. What am I going to do in that block? I think understanding that fundamentally helps block it down a lot more if you're struggling with like, oh, where do I put the begins? Where do I put the ends? Like anything, like especially when you get into things like loops, or if you want it to retry stuff, thinking about, okay, where do I want it to start from? Where is my begin? Where is my end? Where is the rescue? And what's the rescue asking for? So before we get too much further into it, I think we'll just keep heading down this document. The easiest way to do this is just to create a basic method and break it. So I think a lot of us here at Coder did that today, and we did it using a divider. So basically here all I've done is defined a divider method. So it's called divider. It takes two numbers, and it's just going to return the first number by the second number, divided by the second number. Simple, right? So, and we all know that you can't divide something by 0. It just doesn't work. You create black holes, it's bad, so we just don't do it. So if we cruise down a little bit further, I've got that method with the begin. So you can see here with the begin, rescue, and end. So I've got my divider method. So the divider method, the actual method itself, and then I've integrated the begin, rescue, and end. So here's that begin, rescue, end block. There's my method block. So you can kind of see the syntax of where things need to happen. Like I said before, you've got, just spacing this out so it's super clear. Every time I run this method, it's going to every time I call it, the first thing it's going to do is say, oh, begin. Okay, that's like the start of a block. The next thing it's going to do is try and run the code inside of that block. If it breaks, it's going to roll to this rescue, and then it's going to put, you rescue me from ultimate shame, I am sorry. So if we run that, right, because down here I've said puts divider 1 divided by 0. It doesn't work. But if I put, let's say 10 divided by 5, it returns 2. So it's completely disregarding this whole thing. It doesn't need it. It's not running into an error. It doesn't have a rescue or anything. Easy, cool. I think like looking at that and being like, okay, if I ever want to integrate some sort of rescue, like error handling, that's sort of like the basis of it in one way. There's like 1,000 different ways to do things that I'm not aware of. So I'm sure someone's looking at this being like, you idiot. And that's okay. We're all learning. So I think before I move on to the next thing, one thing I will show you here. So we've put a rescue in that's supposed to rescue us from errors, right? So it'll definitely rescue us from dividing by 0. If like it just can't divide what we've put into it. But here it's asking for 2 arguments. So another error that could happen is it's given 3 arguments. So 1, 3, and 5. 1, 5, and 3. What happens then? So now it's not getting handled the way I want it to. So the first time it was handled, it gave me this. You rescue me from ultimate shame. And this time, when I've brought up another error, like I've caused it to have an error, it hasn't given me that. So this whole rescue thing didn't work. Why is that happening? And I think one way, I don't know, like the way it works is basically like in order for this to execute, it has to get into this method. I'm calling a method, I'm saying divider 153, and then before it even starts running, it said, hang on a second, this is like too many arguments, I'm gonna crash. Like I'm gonna throw an error. So this is like above this, if that makes sense. Like it doesn't even get to the begin block. Like if it saw this, it would be like, oh, okay, I'm gonna like see if there's a rescue if things crash, but it doesn't even see this. It's throwing an error there. So this is a different kind of error. It's still a standard error, but it's happening in a different place than inside the method. So how do we deal with it? And I think this is like a good example of where you would put it outside of the method. So here I've put my rescue inside the method. So there's the start of the method, there's the end of the method, and here's my rescue block. And then in this one, I'll just comment out this, otherwise we're going to run into error. Well, we're not run into errors, but it's definitely going to get confusing. Cool. So here we've got begin, rescue, and end, and this is outside of a method. This stands alone. Here's a method that we just talked about. Let's remove that 3rd digit. And actually, let's keep this. So this is still defining my method that I'm using. If I didn't have that, then it would definitely throw an error. So let's run it and see what happens. So I've got begin puts divider, so it's going to try and run that method. It's going to be 1 dividing by 0. And it's going to rescue, and it's going to say, again, you have come to the aid of in my time of darkness. So we'll run that. You have rescued me from ultimate shame. Okay, so it's gone into that method. It's tried to do the thing. So it's gone into it. It's got the correct number of arguments, and therefore it's going into the method to try and do things. So if we look inside the method, then it's starting begin, return these things. If it doesn't work, put this, which is why, even though we've put a begin rescue here, it's not getting to that. It's erroring inside of the method, so it's going to stop there, which is why we get this output. If I give it an extra argument, so now it's got 3 instead of the 2 that it's looking for, again, you have come to my aid in times of darkness. Cool. So this time, it's crashing out before it even gets into the method. So it's staying that level above. and then it rescues here instead of inside the method, if that makes sense. So we've got like two levels of error handling here. One thing that I wanted to touch on as well, just because it's here, and I think it'll be easy to explain here, is I think some people were talking about this thing. What is it? Why do we do it? The hash rocket E is essentially what we're doing is, okay, so when you rescue something, it's throwing an error and it's like catching that error and showing you the error. Well, it's not showing you the error, but it's catching the error. And then it's looking below to see if it's going to do anything. What this hash rocket E is basically assigning that error to a variable. So now we have that error stored in a variable. So if you were like, what is E? E is, in this case, an argument error. Yeah, so like then we can do stuff with it. And something to make that a little bit more clear, I'll come down here and just grab some of this things that I've prepared earlier. Otherwise it's going to take me about 5 hours to type all this out. Cool. So we've added a little bit to our rescue here. We've said begin puts divider. If that throws an error before it even gets into the method, it's going to rescue it. It's going to assign that error to a variable, and then we can do stuff to that thing. So like the error itself, like the error that's being thrown is a class, it's an object, and therefore we can do stuff with it. If you go into the Ruby documentation, you can like look at all the methods that you can call on an error. And that's essentially what we're doing here. So what I'm doing, when it throws the error, puts, again, you've come in my time of darkness, great, puts error class, and then it's going to interpolate, like string interpolate e.class. So it's calling the class method on the error. And then it's going to say error message. It's calling the message method on the error itself and a backtrace. So when I run it this time, cool, we've got some more stuff to look at. So it's giving us a class. So this is a string I put in, error class, and it tells me it's an argument error. Error message, wrong number of arguments given 3, expected 2. Error backtrace, and then it backtraces where it's crashed out. So like this is cool in the sense that when you rescue hash rocket E or rescue hash rocket to whatever you want, it doesn't have to be E, you can write error or farkle or whatever. You can do cool stuff with how you then like present that information to either you or another user or whatever. It provides a little bit more flexibility in your error handling. Yeah, so I thought it was pretty cool. So we'll keep cruising down the line. Okay, so here the next sort of step is like raising errors. And I think I saw a couple of people getting a little confused around how you actually raise an error. Do you need to begin? Do you need to rescue? Do you need to end? And you don't at all. Raise will be like, really you can put raise anywhere. If you like just make a method that says raise error, and then you in that method you just put, like if we just get rid of all this stuff, like this, it doesn't need a input or whatever. Oh, that doesn't work. There we go. If I just called string validator, all it would do is raise an error. That's it. That's all you need to do. Raise standard error. Boom. It's just raising errors. That's the entire method, if that's something that you so desire. But if we get rid of all that stuff, we can see what's actually done here. So with that in mind, being like, okay, if I want to raise an error, all I have to do is type raise and then put in the error that I want to raise. We can then do fun things with it. So for this one, it's a string validator. It takes an input, and what it's going to do is check whether that input is a string. And if it's not a string, it's going to raise an error. Otherwise, it's just going to give that string back to you. It's going to give back the input that you gave it. So super simple. If the input class is a string, isn't a string. So, oh God, messing things up. There we go. If the input class is not a string, it's going to raise a standard error, and that's it. Otherwise, it's going to return the input. So if we uncomment this, make sure everything's coming out. Oh. Whoops. We don't need this anymore. So if we go back down to here, so this is coming out. So what I'm going to try and do is puts the string validator with the value 9. So that's an integer. It should throw errors, or at this time, raise a standard error, because that's what I've asked it to do. And boom, that's what it's done. String validator, standard error. Raising a standard error. Cool, pretty sweet. And then just to make sure it actually works, so we can now comment that. I think it's worth also noting that like each time this does it, it ends the program, like it stops. So if I uncomment this, it's got put string validator, I am a string, and I try and run it, we don't even get that far. It just goes to the standard error and stops right there. So if we uncomment this, oh, my monitor's changing color. Okay, and now we get I'm a string. Great, it passes. So it's looked at it, it said, this is a string, I don't need to raise an error, and therefore I'm going to return your input, Yahtzee. Ugh, can't say that word anymore. Cool, I think there's like some cool stuff that we can also do with our standard error. So like if I want to make this a little bit different, like when I raise the standard error, if I want it to say something, what I can do is pass it an argument. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. And I'm going to show you them all just because I think it makes sense when you see all of them just to know that they're relatively the same thing. Maybe they're not the same thing, but in my eyes, they're the same thing. So if someone knows that they're different, please tell me so I learn something as well. So say we raise our standard error, and when it raises, I want to say, I am sorry, this is not a string. Sad beep. Yeah, it yells sad beep. So if we try that again, except with a string that's wrong, or integer. Cool, now it gives us an actual message. So we've actually given it an argument, raise standard error, and then we've passed this argument into the standard error, and therefore it's giving us this message. Pretty sweet. A different way to do this, and a different way of thinking about it, I think that helps with like the object-oriented programming stuff that we've been doing so far, is the same thing happens if we go standard error dot new, and then we'll just put this in brackets so it's obvious. So this is the input, standard error new, and then I'm passing an argument, and then what happens? Great. I am sorry, this is not a string, same thing. We're getting the same result. So it's a just different way of passing an error. And there is even cooler things that you can do with that, which I'm going to get to next. So we've raised the standard error where we want it, only using raise, no begin, rescue, and end. Sweet. So if we keep cruising down, let's, yeah. Let's keep going down, 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 down. All right, defining custom errors. This is where it starts to get a little bit finicky, and I might say some things that are wrong, and that's okay. You can look, if you catch me out, then sweet, you know your stuff, and like, it's good, it's critical, right? Okay, so this time, with raising our standard errors, like raising an error, so it's like nice to be able to put more information into it. Like if we raise an error, we want to, if we go as far as to say, when this happens, I want to raise an error, then we can also go a little bit further and say, okay, what kind of error is being raised and what is it saying? The reason this can be interesting and important is that you can have different things catching different errors if you're like passing all sorts of different stuff into a method. Or having different inputs, like you can catch argument errors, you can take like zero div errors and all sorts of different standard errors. I'm not going to pretend that I know them all off the top of my head. So in this example, basically what I've done is created a new class called not a string standard error, and we're going to ignore this for now. Yeah, we're going to ignore that and we'll get back to it. So not a string, we've created a new class called not a string, and it's inheriting from standard error. So it has all the same things that standard error has, and that's important in the sense that if you go back, you remember I like got e dot and I did things with it. I like gave it methods, I passed it methods. So yeah, like it's acting as an error. And also if you like instantiate, if you just do class not a string, don't inherit from standard error and raise it. I'm not sure. I mean, this is a good test, but why not? Let's figure out what happens. So Great, I'm just gonna change that so it's not inheriting from standard error anymore. So I've done a string validator, not a string raise, not a string. So it's, I'm pretty sure, yeah, it's the same thing as up there, except this time it's raising my custom error, maybe, if the standard error things works. So we'll comment that out. So it's gonna do that one. What happens? Oh, cool. It says type error. Interesting. I'll look into that more. Interesting to know. You can do your own research on that one. So let's go back to the normal one. Great. Cool. Not a string inheriting from standard error. When I raise it, it says this is not a string instead of standard error. Cool. That just gives us a little bit more information, right? Now let's say that I am writing different, like multiple methods, and maybe I want to incorporate this not a string thing into all of them, and a message as well. And like repeating myself would be having like 3 different methods that all do different validation on strings, and each time, or like whatever, and each time I want to raise a not a string method and I want it to display a message. So for each of them, I would have to go through and write like, this is the message. I'd have to write that 3 times, which is like a waste of time. So what you can do is actually do that in your class. So if we uncomment this, oops, oh God, pick the guy who's not very good at using VS Code. Sweet, if we add an initialize method, we super in, and then with that super, we're setting a default. Like we're always passing it every time it's initialized. We can now, every time we raise not a string, it will give us a message. Cool, so it's still not a string error, but this time it's giving us that message, and it's not being written here, it's being written in the class. So that's like some more cool stuff with how you can actually like use your classes to like further customize your errors and what's being passed back. This is like real cool from a theoretical standpoint, and every time I try and put it in any of my code, I'm like, oh my God, why isn't it working? Or is this like really necessary? And just to make sure it actually still works, we'll pass it something that's legit. Shigading. And I'm string. Great, perfect. Sweet. So that's like basically it. I think like just to like show something really cool, I did this on LinkedIn Learning. If any of you have access to that platform, I highly recommend it. They're really, really good at going through this stuff step by step and teaching you a bunch. In some ways, I've learned a little bit more there, just because they like, you go through and you do things really methodically and you can follow along, and I don't know, like, I think it's cool. I don't know, it's just really well done. Anyway, that's enough like fanboying about that. Let's go over. So this is something I did with them real quick, not real quick. That's still kind of pulling from that idea of making your own class and then customizing it even more to do even more cool things. So if I switch over to this, so we're in a new file. This is what I did before a couple of days ago. And if I run it, it says no even numbers, no even numbers. The array provided was XYZ. So if we go through this code real quick, we've got a class, we've created a new error. It's called no even numbers. It inherits from standard error. And every time you initialize it, it's going to expect you to give it an array. And this is very specific for the method that we're using it on. It's also going to have a actual message, and the array there, which is now accessible by the ATTR accessor, is here. So every time it's got its own instance variable, which is pretty cool. And then down here, we've got an even numbers array method. So in this, it is raising different errors. So the first one is, unless the array is an array, we're going to raise an argument error. Make sense? If the array length is 0, so if you put in an empty array, it's going to raise a standard error, and that error is going to say too few elements. And then when you get this array, we're going to create a new array called even array. It's going to find all of the even numbers, and if that is equal to 0, it's going to raise a no even numbers array, a no even numbers error, and it's going to pass at the array that was put in, and therefore we can actually like do more stuff with it. So here we've got begin, put, and then we're doing this rescue, put, and then okay, and this is like taking it one step further, and now so what's happened is it's thrown an error, it's rescuing, and then we're going to put the class, the message, and then put the array. So this whole no even numbers has been turned into E, and then we're doing all this stuff with it. I don't know, it's just like an example. Like this is like, even reading it out now, I'm like, oh man, there's like little bits of this that I don't super understand. But like looking at this and being like, oh wow, like this is an error. Like this is an error, and not disguised, but an error that you've decided to make much nicer. You know, like it's told us what's in the array that was provided as well, not instead of just being like, meh, it doesn't work. So yeah, I don't know, some things to talk about, some things to think about. This video is really long. So if you got through it all the way, gold star. I'd offer to buy you a beer, but I can't because I'm stuck in my house. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it maybe clarified some things, if not, or like showed you some cool things that you can do with errors. I'm certainly not, like, my brain just boggles with like the amount of stuff that you could potentially do with all of this. And then it's like when to handle the error, when not to handle it, I don't know. Anyway, so for those of us at Coder, enjoy your next amount of time off, and then I'm sure happy coding.